You plan to take to the Senate floor on Wednesday, as I just said, and I'm just going to quote a little bit from your speech. You said 2017 was a year which saw the truth, objective, empirical, evidence-based truth, more battered and abused than any other in the history of our country, at the hands of the most powerful figure in our government. What concerns you most about this?
What concerns me is when you use phrases like the enemy of the people, then you trace that phrase back, and it was not a good origin. Really, it was popularized by Joseph Stalin. And I am in no way comparing President Trump to Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was a killer. Our president is not. But it just puzzles me as to why you would use a phrase that is so loaded and that has such deeper meaning, the press being the enemy of the people. And so that is a big concern. What this president does, the most powerful man in the world, has lasting implications, and it has implications for journalists worldwide as well as our free press here in this country.
And I was going to, you answered it for me. I was going to say, really, Stalin? But you obviously answered the inevitable questions people will have over that comparison.
Right.
But of course, when you take...
If the American president...
You go ahead.
I was going to say, if the American president was like Stalin, you know, people like me would be in Gitmo or worse. So no, there's no comparison there to the man. But it just puzzles me as to why any American president would use a phrase so associated with somebody like Joseph Stalin. It just doesn't comport, and it's not good for any of us.
So, I mean, let's drill down a little bit. I mean, it's obviously relentless for all of us, and it has enabled many foreign leaders to take a page out of President Trump's book and batter us over the head with that fake news. But specifically to the U.S. democracy, what bothers you about it? Do you think the U.S. democracy is fragile enough to succumb to this kind of, as you say, relentless daily attack on the press?
Well, gratefully, our institutions are strong, and certainly we have protections for a free press. But it's not good when the president utters falsehoods like, well, the crowd size was bigger than any in the past. That's more innocuous and doesn't mean as much. But to say things like the Russia matter just broadly without being more precise is a hoax, or Russia's intervention in the U.S. election is a hoax. That is not a hoax. We know that Russia did try to influence our election, and simply dismissing that as fake news is damaging. And when that is just done reflexively, day after day, then that has real consequences.
Let me just go down to some policy right now. All last week, there was the White House discussions over the Dreamers, and you're one of the co-sponsors of this. President Trump has basically said that DACA is probably dead because the Democrats don't really want it, and they just want to talk and take desperately needed money away from our military. Is that your take as well? Is it all the Democrats' fault?
No, it's not. I've been in the House and the Senate for nearly 18 years now, and I've worked with the Democrats on this issue, on immigration issues broadly, for all of that time. And they are working in good faith. Those are certainly that I'm working with now. We have a bipartisan proposal that started with 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and we're adding Republicans and Democrats in the coming days. It's frankly the only bill in town. It's the only bipartisan bill. We need 60 votes to pass anything in the Senate. And so it's going to be a bipartisan bill, and the Democrats are acting in good faith. There are compromises that are being made on both sides. I've been involved in that process, and we'll continue to hone that bill, but it'll be introduced this week with more than 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans.
So describe, I mean, I know you didn't go to the next meeting at the White House to press the immigration bill, but we understand that it surprised the legislators who were there when President Trump invited also 2, fairly hardliners on this issue, Senators Tom Cotton and David Perdue.
Right.
And CNN reports that they were there specifically to slow down any momentum behind your compromise deal. What's your take on that? Do you think that's the case?
Well, all I know is Dick Durbin and Lindsey Graham went to the White House to present the president with the proposal. The president had asked us to come back with a bipartisan bill that covered 4 items: DACA itself, border security, dealing with chain migration, and also the diversity visa. And we did that in the legislation. But when they went to the White House, the president basically said, get back to the drawing board. So that's what we've done, and we're adding Republican and Democratic co-sponsors.
And Senator, obviously it was at that second meeting that senators report the president used pretty derogatory language to describe immigrants from certain countries. He denies using that. Well, what can you tell us about what was actually said? And then in relation to immigration, obviously that has really put the steam up everybody in Africa, in Haiti, and other such places who feel targeted.
Right. Well, I went to a meeting directly following the meeting that Dick Durbin and Lindsey Graham had at the White House, and it was described to me what was said in the meeting. That was before those words went public, and I can just say what was described in the meeting I had was identical to what was reported later in the news. And your point about the broader damage of a statement like that, I chair the Africa Subcommittee. We work with, obviously, all the African countries on sharing intelligence, on military deployments, on humanitarian issues, and that causes long-term damage. It really does. And so I was really disheartened to hear that was said.
And all those relationships the United States has built up over years, do you feel that they're at risk in some pretty important places?
Well, in Africa, let me say, it's been troubling for a while. We, more than a year or almost a year into this new administration, we still have no assistant secretary for Africa at the State Department. We're finding it difficult to have oversight hearings and to have responsible State Department officials with knowledge of what's going on in particular countries or regions, or at least with purview or authority. And so and then to have a statement like this following that, I think in hearing the reactions of some of the African countries, it's what I expected to hear, and it's not good long term. We have good relations with most of the African countries, and we have good military relations and intelligence sharing, and we want that to continue. It makes it more difficult when statements like this are made.
And you know, just a wry addition, it's not lost on too many people that the president's saying he wants Norwegian immigrants. Well, the Norwegians, some would say, have a better standard of living than the United States. So, I mean, those wouldn't be the people immigrating en masse to the U.S. anyway.
Well, I can just say that my ancestors came from countries that were not nearly as prosperous as this one. I'm glad that they were welcomed here. We did in the so-called Gang of Eight bill, the bipartisan bill that we did in 2013 that passed the Senate, we did take family immigration from where it is now about 70% of all legal immigration to about 50%, striking more of a balance between those coming who had economic skills that could help the economy and those who come by virtue of family relations. That was part of a broader bill. It was a lot of tough negotiations between Democrats and Republicans to arrive at that figure. I do think we need to strike the balance, but when we strike that balance, we certainly shouldn't do it in a way that is seen to be race-based or based on how poor a country is. There is nothing to say that people who can help our economy and could win a merit-based visa aren't coming from countries that are very poor, and we see that right now. I think the figure somebody put out is that those coming from African countries into our through legal immigration have college degrees at a pretty high rate, maybe higher than our population here in the United States. And so we've had wonderful immigration, coming in, people coming in from some pretty tough countries and escaping some pretty tough situations.
Senator,
I'm glad they're here.
Yeah, Senator, let me get back to you challenging the president from the Senate floor and in other ways as well. What will it take for other Republicans to stick their head over the parapet and do what you're doing?
Well, I hope that more of my colleagues will stand up when the president uses fake news, for example, in ways that I think put journalists across the world in danger. The Committee to Protect Journalists notes that this year we have an all-time high of 262 journalists in prison around the world. 21, I believe, of them are held under false news charges, which sounds very familiar to fake news. There's a lot of countries that use that phrase, dictators around the world, using that phrase now to staunch opposition or peaceful dissent. And that's not right. So I would hope that more of my Republican colleagues would stand up and say, that's not proper, Mr. President.
Okay,
we shouldn't be using that kind of language.
So I want to run through a few statistics because it's it's interesting. Well, first and foremost, for all your criticism of President Trump, he is doing a lot of the policy proposals and passing a lot of the bills and things that you actually support. You know, whether it's you voted to confirm Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, you voted for the Republican tax bill. In fact, you voted with President Trump more than 90% of the time. So, you know, on balance, despite your criticism, do you support him?
I'm a conservative, and when something like health care reform comes up, repealing and replacing Obamacare, I voted some 30 times to repeal and replace Obamacare. Why should somebody expect, because I have disagreements with the president on some policy and behavior, for me to change my vote and vote differently?
Okay.
Should I do it just out of spite or to hobble the presidency? I find it interesting when people expect me, because I have disagreements with the president, to want to hobble him or to vote against what I consider good policy just out of spite. I don't do that, and I don't think I should.
So let me ask you then to put this in sort of a bigger perspective. You know, there are all these new books. There's Fire and Fury by Michael Wolff. There is Trumpocracy by David Frum. And Frum, who's a former Republican speechwriter, says, democracy is a work in progress. So is democracy's undoing. All it takes is for a few good men and women to do nothing. And I just want to note that over a third of Republican senators called on Trump to quit the race after the Access Hollywood tapes. And now most of these senators are firmly behind him. And roughly half the conservative intellectuals who signed the famous Never Trump letter have now fallen in line behind the president. You know, what do you make of this? And how serious is the idea of trying to rein in his worst instincts as you see it, if in fact everybody's, you know, lining up behind him?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for my colleagues. For myself, I will vote with him when I think he's right, although many of things like the tax policy and health care were more a congressional product than a White House product. Right. But there are things that I differ significantly with the president on. For example, I spoke out during the campaign against the Muslim ban. It morphed into a travel ban that is likely constitutional, but I don't think is wise. And I've spoken out against that, as well as on trade. I think it was a massive mistake to exit out of the TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership. It would be equally devastating, or even more so, to get out of NAFTA.
All right, Senator.
So there are things that, a lot of this doesn't come to legislation at this point, but it likely will.
Senator, I wish we had more time. Thank you so much. Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona.